Hi, it's Ashleigh from Sweet Dreams Bake Shop, and today I'm going to be sharing with you all of the treat items that I put in my sweater weather treat box. Starting off with the salted caramel apple pie. If you love a super buttery, flaky crust jam-packed with delicious apples and salted caramel, you are going to love this, and your customers are going to want to put this into their bellies as well. Now, first, when we're starting off making the crust, you want to make sure that you pulse that butter and the flour together. If you don't have the food processor, you can do this with a pastry cutter or with butter knives, but it's so much easier if you do it with a food processor. What you're looking for is little butter crumbles all throughout your flour. Then you want to add your water very sparingly. Make sure that water is super cold. You'll notice the technique I'm using. I'm kind of scooping things up and then pressing it down. This prevents things from getting too overworked, and I'm just going to mix it until I can feel that there's no more liquid and no more dry spots. Cover it in plastic wrap. Once it's all ready, you can split it into 2 discs and then put it in your fridge. Remember, this part is not as important as freezing it or chilling it later on. You can choose whatever apples you would like, but I try to go with an apple that has a nice crisp texture. If you go for a more mushy apple, I find that the filling turns out a little bit grainy, so I'm using some Pink Lady apples, which I already had on hand because my children love this variety. If you have a mandolin slicer, I would definitely use this for the apple pie. You can just get way nicer cuts with a mandolin. Unfortunately, I don't own one, so I'm just using my not so great knife skills. As you guys know, I don't really like to reinvent the wheel, so I often use other people's recipes, but I will say I did change a few things about the recipes throughout this video. I added a little bit more spice to everything because I know a lot of my friends and family love a little bit more spice. One thing I really like about this recipe is that I don't have to cook the apples on the stove at all. The oven is going to do all of the work for me. I also didn't use the caramel sauce recipe that is recommended on the website. Instead, I just used my own caramel sauce recipe that I always use. So if you want to see very detailed instructions on how to do that, you can go ahead and check out that video in the right-hand corner. Because I was making several recipes in one day while I was making this caramel sauce, I did let it go for a slight bit too long. Surprisingly though, I feel like the slightly bitter note really went with the apple pie. I also like to go with slightly more salt than recipes usually say, especially in the caramel sauce, because I find that if I don't add enough salt, I can barely taste that salted caramel aspect. The magic of this crust is the butter, so I really like to generously butter that pan, and make sure you do that with room temperature butter. Now, when I'm rolling out my crust, I like to make sure that it is really nice and thin, especially on the bottom, because nothing is worse than trying to bite through a giant piece of crust. So make sure it's really nice and thin. See how I'm leaving a little bit of an edge whenever I roll that out, and then I'm going to take that edge and I'm going to tuck it under. This ensures that you're going to get a really perfect pie crust all the way around. What I love about filled pies that are warm through and through is it's a lot easier to control that pie crust. Whenever I do pie crusts that are for like chilled pies, like a chocolate cream pie, I find I have to be super picky with the way that I treat this pie crust. A lot of chilling and making sure that I'm weighing it down, but this won't require any pie weights whatsoever, and the shapes that you put into your pie crust are really going to stay there. Be sure to dock your pie crust, which means poking holes in it so that there's ventilation. This will prevent bubbles from forming underneath, but of course you have the filling on top, so it's not as big of a deal. Just in case your caramel sauce isn't perfect, make sure to run it through a sieve so you don't have any of those crystallized sugar chunks in there. You can put that caramel sauce in either cold, or you can do it at room temperature, or even if it's still hot, it will still work. Now it's time for the top layer of the pie crust, and for this you kind of just guesstimate how much you're going to put on, and don't worry, everything can be fixed with your pie crust. See how that's a lot larger than what I had intended? That's fine, because I'm just going to tuck it in, and then I'm going to re-flute the edges again so everything fits together beautifully. Since this is for a sweater weather treat box, I do want to make the top of the pie kind of look like a sweater so that when I cut those individual pieces of pie and put them into the treat box, they will still have a little hint of sweater weather. When putting on all these little pieces on your pie, you really don't need to use any adhesive because we're going to cover the whole thing in an egg yolk mixture anyway, so it's all going to stick. Now I'm going to be using these heart cookie cutters to create some ventilation. Now, in order to make sure that the hearts were showing through once the pie baked, I did put this back into the freezer for about 15 minutes before baking the pie. There are really no specific measurements for this. I just use a splash of whipping cream and some egg yolks, and then I mix it together and I really apply it very, very generously all over the pie, making sure to get every little nook and cranny. A generous sprinkling of turbinado sugar all over, but you can definitely skip this part, though it does add that nice crunch on top. Now, it was a little bit tricky to figure out when this pie was actually done, but when you see all of that caramel bubbling up and most of the crust is really nicely browned, you're probably good to go. Moving on to sweet treat number 2, our oatmeal cream pies. Now, I really followed this recipe pretty much to a T, so there's nothing too special about this. It's a very, very typical oatmeal cookie type recipe, but it tastes absolutely divine. It's very, very chewy, and it has a really nice fluffiness from that Italian meringue buttercream that we put into it later. Just a quick note about my vanilla. You probably noticed that I'm not using the best quality vanilla, and I always find in recipes like this where the vanilla is being baked, it's really not necessary to use a super high quality vanilla. What I love about this recipe is that everything is pretty much done in 2 bowls. I really hate messing up multiple things. So it comes together super easily. Now, I actually used quick oats in this recipe, but I think it calls for rolled oats. But really, they're pretty interchangeable. It's just a slightly different texture that you're going to get from the cookie. You'll notice that I'm also using a very small cookie scoop. I wanted to keep these small so I could make sure that I would have enough for each box. All right, now I'm using my classic Italian meringue buttercream. If you want to go see how I make that, you can go ahead and click that right-hand corner, and I am just piping it onto these cookies. I'm actually being fairly generous with how I'm applying this, and I found when I bit into the cookie, it wasn't overwhelming, so I think this is actually the perfect amount. Try to match up cookies that are alike, and what I mean by that is in shape and size. Sometimes even if you're using a cookie scoop, it won't turn out perfectly the same. Also, make sure when you're putting on that top cookie that you don't really squish it down that much. You're kind of just placing it on really gently. Moving on to sweet treat number 3, my sweater weather sugar cookies. And I love putting something like this into the treat box because it really sells the theme of your treat box very clearly. Now, I already did a full tutorial on this, so you can go ahead and click that in the right-hand corner if you want to see step by step how I made these cookies. Now we are on to sweet treat number 4, which is my spiced cardamom chai macarons. I really love this flavor profile because it's very fall, but it's also something a little bit different. Now, as you guys know, I cannot share my macaron recipe with you because it's a very specialized recipe that I purchased through a class, so I'm not authorized to share it. And I've tried other macaron recipes. This one seems to still reign supreme over all of those, so I'm sorry I can't share it with you. But you can honestly use your favorite macaron recipe and just do what I did to create the same flavor profile. Basically, all I did was take a really great tea, use a black tea if you really want this to cut through very nicely, and you just cut open the tea bags and you add those tea bags directly straight into your macaron batter. I'm sure most of you that have attempted macarons before can make it to this step no problem, but it's this step right here that has all of the magic of the proper macaron. Now really all I can tell you is you want to get kind of a honey-like consistency with your batter, and that's how you know it's going to be right. Hopefully. Whenever I've been creating these treat boxes, I really want to put something different into the box. So I'm making a few boxes with giant macarons. These are quite large, and I would say they're the equivalent of maybe 4 or 5 regular size macarons. Whenever I have kind of bumpy macarons that aren't perfect, and that usually happens with the first tray because the batter loosens up as you go, I like to put on a little topping. Now be careful, you can add sprinkles very easily to macarons before they turn opaque, but you don't want to use anything too heavy. So pearls do not work. They always fall directly in. All I'm using for filling today is an Italian meringue buttercream, my classic Italian meringue buttercream, and then I added in a generous amount of those tea bags again. And you might be wondering, can you actually eat those leaves? And yes, it's totally fine, and it's going to flavor that buttercream super nicely. My least favorite part of making macarons is actually matching up all the shells so they fit perfectly. I don't mind filling them at all, but for some reason, matching them up just seems like the most tedious job to me. I'm constantly having to play around with my oven so that things turn out perfectly white. Now, obviously these brown just a little bit. Luckily, the taste and texture is not compromised. It's just a visual thing. So I decided to airbrush these macarons, and yes, you can airbrush them really easily. And I want them to look very fall-esque, so I'm doing a bunch of different colors and making sure that they're kind of all melding together. If you airbrush with a light hand, then things won't get soggy and it'll dry really quickly. I've made that mistake in past where things just turned out really soggy, so just make sure that you're applying this really gently. Splattering some of my favorite gold luster dust mixed with some vodka, and you do want this to be kind of loose so that you can really splatter it. And if you're wondering, yep, my whole chest was gold after this. I really love the way these turned out, and they just really brighten up the box and bring in that fall feel. Moving along to our final item, the pumpkin spice latte cupcake. Now this recipe is awesome. All you have to do is combine all of those dry ingredients, and then you're going to mix it in with your wet ingredients, and it really comes together very, very quickly. I made these cupcakes twice and they turned out so puffy and beautiful both times. The cupcakes took around 18 minutes at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and while those were cooling, I started mixing up the buttercream, which is basically a straightforward cream cheese frosting that uses American buttercream techniques. I'm using a multi-star tip or a French tip in a piping bag, and I am generously applying all of that onto the cupcake. Now, if you want this more to look like the top of the Starbucks drinks, then you would use a 1M star tip. We all know I love a little bit of glamour, so I'm adding on some of this gold sanding sugar. You don't have to add in a straw, but I thought these looked really cute, and I could have gone with the classic green Starbucks straw, but I really love the gold as it goes well with the sweater weather box. I really wanted to see this all set up beautifully on a plate before I put them into treat boxes, so I decided to make myself a little plate here. Now I did put some candied nuts down in there as well, and a large dose of whipped cream to go with that pie. Highly recommend. Now, because this sweater weather treat box is already quite a long video, I'm going to be including the pricing as well as some pertinent tips to creating the perfect treat box later on in the week, so definitely watch out for that video. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you can be part of this sweetie fam. Right now, I'm uploading daily, so make sure you hit that notification bell so you know when I upload. Also, be sure to comment, request, or ask a question. I love hearing from you guys. Bye!